Constantine, ഃkɒnstəntin, was a 6th-century king of Dumnonia in sub-Roman Britain, who was remembered in later British tradition as a legendary king of Britain. The only contemporary information about him comes from Gildas, who castigated him for various sins, including the murder of 2 royal youths inside a church. The historical Constantine is also known from the genealogies of the Dumnonian kings, and possibly inspired the tradition of Saint Constantine, a king-turned-monk venerated in southwest Britain and elsewhere. In the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth included Constantine in his pseudo-historical chronicle Historia Regum Britanniae, adding details to Gildas' account and making Constantine the successor to King Arthur as King of Britain. Under Geoffrey's influence, Constantine appeared as Arthur's heir in later chronicles. Less commonly, he also appeared in that role in medieval Arthurian romances and in some modern versions of the legend. History. Gildas mentions Constantine in chapters 28 and 29 of his 6th-century work De Rexidio æ Britanniae. He is one of 5 Brittonic kings whom the author rebukes and compares to biblical beasts. Gildas calls Constantine the tyrannical whelp of the unclean lioness of Dumnonia, a reference to the books of Daniel and Revelation, and apparently also a slur directed at his mother. This Dumnonia is generally identified as a kingdom of Dumnonia in southwestern Britain. Scholars such as Lloyd Lane and Leslie Alcock note the possibility that Gildas may have instead intended the territory of the Dumnoni, a tribe in present-day Scotland mentioned by Ptolemy in the 2nd century, but others such as Thomas.D. O'Sullivan consider this unlikely. Gildas says that despite swearing an oath against deceit and tyranny, Constantine disguised himself in an abbot's robes and attacked 2 royal youths, praying before a church altar, killing them and the companions. Gildas is clear that Constantine's sins were manifold even before this, as he had committed many adulteries after casting off his lawfully wedded wife. Gildas encourages Constantine, whom he knows to still be alive at the time, to repent his sins lest he be damned. Scholars generally identify Gildas Constantine with the figure ഃkɒnstəntin Gornia who appears in the genealogies of the kings of Dumnonia. Constantine is mentioned as the father of Urban and the grandfather of the hero Geraint in the Bonedwy Saint, the prose romance Geraint and Enid, and after emendation, the genealogies in Jesus College MS-20. Based on Constantine's placement in the genealogies, Thomas.D. O'Sullivan suggests a floorite for Constantine of 520 to 523. Saint Constantine, the historical Constantine of Dumnonia, may have influenced later traditions, known in southwestern Britain as well as in Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, about of Saint Constantine, who was usually said to have been a king who gave up his crown to become a monk. The Cornish and Welsh traditions especially may have been influenced by Gildas. In particular, his adjuration for Constantine to repent. The belief may have been that the reproach eventually worked. The 2 major centers for the cult use of St. Constantine were the church in Constantine Parish and the chapel of St. Constantine in St. Merrin Parish, both in Cornwall. The former was established by at least the 11th century, as it is mentioned in Ridge Archer's 11th century Life of St. David. At this time it may have supported a clerical community, but in later centuries it became simply a parish church. The chapel at Constantine Bay had a holy well, and was the center of its own sub-parish. The Annales Cambriae and the Annals of Ulster record the conversion of a certain Constantine. These may be a reference to the Cornish saint and, therefore, to the historical figure. A number of subsequent religious texts refer to Constantine, generally associating him with Cornwall, often specifically as its king. The Life of St. David says that Constantine, king of Cornwall, gave up his crown and joined St. David's monastery at Menevia. The Vitae Petrocae includes an episode in which St. Petroc protects a stag being hunted by a wealthy man named Constantine, who eventually converts and becomes a monk. Here, Constantine is not said to be king, but a 12th century text referring to this story, the Miracula, specifically names him as such, further adding that upon his conversion he gave Petroc an ivory horn that became one of the saint's chief relics. A number of other traditions attested across Britain describe saints or kings named Constantine, suggesting a confusion and conflation of various figures. Other sites in southwestern Britain associated with figures named Constantine include the Church of Milton Abbot, Devon, a chapel in nearby Duntitan, Devon, and another chapel in Illigan, Cornwall. The two Devon sites may have been dedicated instead to Constantine the Great, as local churches were subject to Tavistock Abbey, dedicated to Constantine the Great's mother Helena. In Wales, two churches were dedicated to Constantine, Llangwstennin and Welsh Bickna. The church in Govan in present-day Scotland was also dedicated to a St. Constantine. Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Chronicle tradition. Historia Regum Britanniae. Geoffrey of Monmouth includes Constantine in a section of his Historia Regum Britanniae adapted from Gildas. As he does throughout the work, Geoffrey manipulates his source material, recasting Gildas-approved kings as successors, rather than contemporaries as in the Excidio. In addition to Gildas, Geoffrey evidently knew the Dumnonian genealogy essentially as it appears in Geraint and Enid's similar sources. He adds a number of other details not found in earlier sources, identifying Constantine as the son of Cadw, a Cornish ruler known in Welsh tradition as Cadway mab Geraint. Notably, Geoffrey's Constantine is King Arthur's kinsman and succeeds him as King of the Britons. Norris J. Lacey and Geoffrey Ashe suggest Geoffrey made this Arthurian connection based on an existing tradition locating Arthur's birthplace in southwest Britain. However, noting that the earliest references place Arthur in northern Britain rather than the southwest, Rachel Bromwich considers the connection an arbitrary invention by Geoffrey, perhaps suggested by his earlier inventions of familial ties between Arthur and Constantine the Great and the usurper Constantine III. In Geoffrey, Arthur passes his crown to his relative Constantine after being mortally wounded by the traitor Mordred in the Battle of Camlan. Geoffrey identifies Gildas' royal youths with Mordred's two sons, who, along with the Saxon allies, continue the father's insurrection after his death. After many battles, Constantine routs the rebels, and Mordred's sons flee to London and Winchester, where they hide in a church and a friary, respectively. Constantine hunts them down and executes them before the altars of the sanctuaries. Divine retribution for this transgression comes 3 years later when Constantine is killed by his nephew Aurelius Comnenus, precipitating a civil war. He is buried at Stonehenge alongside other kings of Britain. Latin scholar Neil Wright considers Geoffrey's changes to Gildas to be deliberate reformulations that produce a more sympathetic picture of Constantine and his successors. For Wright, identifying the royal youths as traitors justifies the killing, reducing Constantine's offense from murder to sacrilege. Scholars regard Geoffrey's depiction of Constantine as pessimistic overall, however, highlighting how little of Arthur's legacy survives his death. Later chronicles Geoffrey returned to Constantine's struggles and untimely murder in his later work Vita Merlini. The text, set during the reign of Aurelius Comnenus, recounts how Constantine gave Mordred's sons a cruel death, and ended the destructive rebellion, omitting details of the killing. Constantine ruled only briefly before Comnenus rose up and killed him, seizing the kingdom he now governs poorly. Rosemary Morris writes that Vita Merlini reinforces the Historia's message that Constantine was unable to perpetuate the glories of Arthur's reign. Variants of Geoffrey's version of Constantine appeared in the numerous later adaptations of the Historia, which were widely regarded as authentic in the Middle Ages. Such variants include Wace's Anglo-Norman Roman de Brute, the Welsh Brute y Brenhined, and Layamon's English Brute. These typically reflect Geoffrey's cynicism about the character. Layamon, however, adds a touch of optimism, writing that Constantine successfully if briefly answered Arthur's charge to rule in his manner. Later traditions. Medieval Romance and Prose tradition. Constantine does not figure strongly in the Arthurian Romance traditions or prose cycles. He is absent in the French Vulgate and post-Vulgate cycles, in which Lancelot and his king kill off Mordred's sons, and no successor to Arthur appears. Some scholars find this omission significant. Rosemary Morris suggests these versions downplay the issue of a designated heir to Arthur to heighten the stakes of Mordred's usurpation and magnify Lancelot's role in the story. Richard Traxler writes that the exclusion of an heir adds a sense of finality to the Arthurian story after Arthur's death. Constantine does appear in some medieval works. In Jean d'Outremuse's 14th-century L'Iméa des Histes, Lancelot installs Constantine on the throne after Arthur's death. He is King of Britain in some versions of the Havelock the Dane legend, beginning with Geoffrey Gaimard's 12th-century Histoire des Anglais. He is also mentioned as Arthur's successor in the 14th-century English alliterative poem known as the alliterative Morte Arthur. Constantine also appears as Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, including sections adapted from the alliterative Morte. George Ferreira de Vasconcelos's 16th-century Portuguese novel Memorial das Proezas da Segunda Tavola Redonda fuses Constantine with the ubiquitous Round Table Knight Sagramor, creating Sagrama Constantino, Arthur's son-in-law and heir. As king, he forms a new round table to defeat the old enemies and continue the glory of Arthurian Britain. Modern literature and media. Constantine features in some modern treatments of the legend. Katrina Trask's Under King Constantine, an 1892 book comprising 3 long romantic poems, is set in his reign. He is an important unseen character in Henry Newbolt's 1895 play ordered in his usual role as Arthur's successor. He similarly appears in Rosemary Sutcliffe's 1963 novel Sordid Sunset, in which the grievously wounded Arthos voluntarily passes the crown to him. In Park Godwin's 1984 novel Beloved Exile, Constantine is one of several nobles fighting Guinevere, the protagonist, in a bid to succeed Arthur. He is the chief protagonist of the 1990 computer game Spirit of Excalibur. Players control Constantine and his allies as they defend the kingdom. After Arthur's death, Darrell Schweitz's 1995 fantasy story, The Epilogue of the Sword, features an aging Lancelot returning to serve Constantine against the Saxons. Constantine elaborately figures into Arthur Phillip's 2011 novel The Tragedy of Arthur. which centers on an apocryphal Arthurian play attributed to William Shakespeare that the narrator, a fictional version of Phillips, insists is a hoax created by his father. In the play within the novel, Constantine is Guinevera's brother and Arthur's vassal and heir. The novel's narrator claims that Constantine is based on his father's old nemesis, prosecutor Ted Constantine.